India. Today it's a country with a massive population, but it's also extremely diverse. Because of that, making a single video on the entirety of India 1,000 years ago would not only be very impractical, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Medieval India was united in a way through certain aspects of shared culture, especially religious traditions, but to speak of India as a unified entity at the time would be anachronistic. No. Instead, we're going to be looking at one of the many kingdoms that existed in South Asia at the time, though one that was probably the most powerful. We're looking at a kingdom which was at its height in the 1020s. Today, we're taking a look at the South Indian kingdom of the Cholas 1,000 years ago. Before we get started, there's a few things that I should mention. First of all, there's our sources. Not every culture has had a history writing tradition the way that we think of it, writing historical narratives for the benefit of future or even contemporary readers. In the case of South India, most of our information comes from inscriptions, either on copper plates kept in temples or directly onto the stone of the temple walls. There are thousands of these inscriptions, but most of them are about donations to the temples or other sorts of land transactions, which usually give us a bit of information about the people involved or the circumstances. There's also inscriptions that sometimes commemorate events. Because of this, there's a lot of questions that are open, and historians sometimes vary widely on their interpretations. I'm going to try and present various opinions in this video, but in order to keep it somewhat cohesive, I'm occasionally going to have to make some choices as to which opinions I give more weight to. If you want to learn more, as always, I have a list of recommended readings in the video's description. And that brings me to point number 2. I am not a historian of medieval India. A glance at my channel will make it clear that medieval Europe is my area of expertise. But I've tried to use my training as a historian to present this topic as best as I possibly can. That being said, if anyone who has studied medieval Indian history has any input or corrections or anything else, feel free to put them in the comments below. With that out of the way, let's get to the history. When we talk about the Chola, we're referring to a dynasty, one which might have existed as far back as the 3rd century BCE. It's a dynasty from South India, as I've mentioned, originating in the modern Indian state of Tamil Nadu in the southeast, meaning they were speakers of the Tamil language. In the 9th century CE, the Chola had been tributaries of the Pallava dynasty in the north. But around 850, they asserted their independence and ruled over the lower part and delta of the Kaveri River, which would remain the core part of their realm, sometimes called Chola Mandalam. They remained independent, but not too influential, until the reign of Rajendra Chola I in the late 10th and early 11th century. Rajaraja conquered the Pallavas to the north, the Pandyas to the south, and various other neighboring realms, growing the Chola kingdom into a veritable empire. And it's for this reason that Rajaraja and his successors in the 11th century are often called the Imperial Cholas. By the 1020s, Rajaraja had died and his son Rajendra Chola I succeeded to the throne and followed closely in his father's footsteps, organizing several large campaigns of his own, including in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and against the Chalukyas. So, with that background in mind, how did the Chola Empire work? Well, there's actually been a lot written on this topic. In the 1930s, with a revision in the 50s, Nilakantra Sastri wrote what would be the fundamental book on the Cholas, and in it he claimed that the Chola state was extremely centralized, with a large bureaucracy meant to effectively extract taxation from the various provinces and support a large standing army. Since then, there have been various responses. In the 80s, Burton Stein argued for a segmentary state, where the Cholas only really had much direct power over their core in the Kaveri River basin, with the rest of their realm ruled by local chiefs who didn't give taxes to the king, but supported him in war due to a sort of sacred and symbolic legitimacy, meaning there was no bureaucracy and no standing army. Today, most historians seem to support the existence of some sort of bureaucracy and standing army, although how big that army was is unclear. Inscriptions make specific mention of regiments and garrisons, but it's possible that the military class was relatively small in peacetime and mercenaries, feudal allies, and non-professional soldiers could have augmented the army during campaigns. Again, it's debated. Most historians today do believe, however, that the more peripheral parts of the kingdom were likely more like tributaries than direct subjects, with largely autonomous local leaders, and land taxation may have been difficult or impossible to extract. It's likely that the Cholas were most able to control the regions of Tonde Mandalam, the old lands of the Pallavas, Pandi Mandalam, that of the Pandyas, and Kongu Mandalam around the upper Kaveri River. But even here, local forces, not to mention bureaucratic inefficiencies, might have made their power slightly less secure than in the central Chola Mandalam. Around the 1020s, trouble controlling certain parts of the kingdom led Rajendra to create 3 viceroyalties, headed by his sons, in Pandi Mandalam, northern Sri Lanka, and southern Karnataka. In Pandi Mandalam, the Pandyas were regularly causing trouble and trying to re-establish their independence, and Rajendra probably figured having one of his sons in command there would make it easier to suppress them and establish control. In Sri Lanka, the northern part of the island had been taken over by Rajendra's father, and its wealthy Buddhist monasteries and royal palace had been thoroughly looted. Rajendra himself had conducted campaigns to further loot and subjugate the south, but here too, and even more than in Pandi Mandalam, Sinhalese princes continued to fight the Cholas, so again, a royal presence was likely seen by Rajendra as a necessity. But back to the mainland. Southeast India is a land of rivers flowing from the Eastern Ghat Mountains and through large plains. Because of this, medieval Chola society was mostly rural. Most people lived near rivers, and villages were established around wells and channels, which took water from the river during the wet season to irrigate their crops, the staple of which was rice. There were larger towns, but these were still relatively small, and they were usually established around temples or royal centers. Temples were important institutions, socially, economically, and bureaucratically, and they were often big landowners. Many temples had Brahmadeya, or lands given to the Brahmin community which had special rights. For those who aren't familiar, Brahmin are a special priestly caste in Vedic Hindu tradition, and they were the ones running most of these temples. Smaller villages were gathered into nadus, which had their own councils deciding on local matters, and which dealt with the royal government. The nadus, and indeed many of the villages, were dominated by a handful of powerful landowning families, who often employed professional cultivators to work their lands, alongside slaves. It's possible that in earlier times land was held more communally. This is another thing that's debated. But by the early 11th century, a small landholding elite, the Valalas, was definitely becoming the norm, though there were still smaller landowners who cultivated their own land as well. Some towns, however, called Nagaram, were controlled by merchants, and they may have been depots and warehouses. There were also the Patanam on the coast, which were port cities where international trade took place. Merchants had long been important in South India since they were central to the vast trade across the Indian Ocean. They were also largely autonomous from kings, who might have gotten some taxes from the ports, but otherwise weren't too involved in merchant activities. Many of these autonomous merchants were organized into powerful merchant guilds, which had their own ruling councils, their own traditions, their own nagaram, and even their own soldiers. In a way, they were almost a state within a state. The Chola kings could borrow from them if they needed money, and their soldiers may have participated in several royal campaigns. As for the kings, they resided in their capital in the Kaveri Delta. Until the 1020s, this was at Tanjapuri, today called Tanjavur. But around this time, Rajendra began to build a new capital further north, called Ganjekonda Cholapuram. Try saying that 5 times fast. The name of the city is actually quite significant, and we will be coming back to it later. The capital was central to Rajendra's ability to establish and promote his authority over the realm. For one, it was the location of a massive temple. Rajendra's father Rajaraja had built one in Tanjapuri, and Rajendra would build his own in his new capital, completed probably around 1035. Temple building was important for the religious tradition that the Cholas followed. In the past, kings had emphasized ancient Vedic sacrifices as the main manifestation of one's relationship with the gods. But in South India, the Bhakti tradition had been gaining popularity in the early Middle Ages. This tradition emphasized a relationship of reverence and devotion towards the gods, especially Shiva and his manifestations, since it mainly emerged from the Shaiva tradition which saw him as the supreme god. Temples became a locus of devotion, and the building of one was itself a form of devotion. And so the Cholas built, maintained, and made donations to many temples, mainly to Shiva. Having a big royal temple in your capital was a great form of devotion, and it made the king central to religion. And although we shouldn't discount the genuine religious devotion of Chola kings, it was also a great political tool. A temple of this size was expensive to maintain, and so Rajendra, again in imitation of his father, granted it the revenues from various lands. However, a lot of the lands granted to it were from far-off parts of the kingdom, even parts in the peripheries where the king probably couldn't get much taxes for himself. It was much harder for semi-autonomous chiefs, however, to refuse the age-old tradition of land grants to temples. Perhaps less tangibly, the temple placing the king in the center of religion also helped the imperial Cholas to maintain their lofty status. A close connection between kings and gods was not uncommon in medieval India, and the Cholas connected themselves very closely to Shiva. They didn't quite claim to be gods per se, but they did elevate themselves to be godlike, imbued somehow with Shiva's power. In fact, the image I've been using of Rajendra throughout this video comes from a sculpture on his temple depicting him being garlanded by Shiva, a clear depiction of divine support. They named their temples, and even the aniconic lingas representing Shiva at their centers, after themselves, and built temples over the tombs of their ancestors. They never stopped being humans, but again, there was something godlike about them. In fact, gods were also depicted more as kings in art, which strengthened the connection even more. The Cholas also made lots of donations to temples, which we know a lot about because of the inscriptions we rely on for most of our information. But obviously donations can't be maintained without something to donate. And although the Cholas did receive taxes, a big chunk of their wealth came from their military campaigns and the plunder they got from them. I mentioned the looting of Sri Lanka earlier, but this wasn't the only campaign. In fact, regular raiding campaigns against their neighbors allowed the imperial Cholas to maintain their dominating position. Plunder could be donated to temples or given out as gifts to supporters, and it could also allow the king to maintain a larger army than he otherwise could through taxation alone. There was also a big ideological factor in these wars. By fighting their neighbors and forcing them to submit, even if this was only a recognition of Chola superiority and not really a conquest, the king reinforced his legitimacy at home and grew his prestige and sphere of influence abroad. This was tied to the long-established concept of Digvijaya, where powerful kings were expected to establish a wide-reaching, in theory universal, hegemony. Almost exactly 1,000 years ago, in 1022 and 1023, Rajendra conducted a campaign far north into the lower Gangetic plain, where he defeated the Pala king Mahipala. This victory was quite important, and it prompted Rajendra to build his new capital, probably in part funded by loot obtained from it. In fact, archaeological excavations of his palace have uncovered decorated red stones, which probably originated from Bengal and may have been taken as trophies. But the victory's symbolic significance came mainly with the fact that the Palas ruled over a large stretch of the river Ganges, which is an extremely holy river in Hindu tradition, although there was a Chola origin myth that claims a Brahmin in ancient times revealed that the Kaveri was even more holy. But still, the symbol of a victory over the Ganges was important to the idea that Rajendra was Chakravarti, or universal monarch, and bound to the divine. In fact, this is where his capital's name comes in. Ganjaikonda Cholapuram means the city of the Chola who conquered the Ganges. Similarly, his new temple would be called Ganjaikonda Cholisvaram, though today it's often just called the Big Temple, just like his father's temple in Tanjavur. Now, Rajendra didn't annex the Pala kingdom into his realm. This was a campaign of power projection. But he did conquer the Ganges in another way. According to the inscription which tells us about this campaign, Rajendra made the defeated Bengali princes carry jars of water from the Ganges all the way to his new capital, which, by the way, is about 2,000 kilometers, in order to fill a sacred basin called the Chola Ganjam, an act which seethes with symbolic meaning. But this was only one of Rajendra's most famous and important campaigns. The other also took place in the 1020s, specifically in 1025, all the way in Southeast Asia. That year, Rajendra sailed with his army to the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, in modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, and raided several cities belonging to Srivijaya. This campaign specifically has been debated to a great extent, mainly about the reasons for it. On the one hand, some have argued that this was a war over trade, specifically the ability for Chola merchants to pass through the Strait of Malacca, and to a lesser extent the Sunda Strait further south, on their way to China. On the other hand, others have argued that it was just a campaign for plunder and prestige like the rest of them. Now, Srivijaya was indeed a fairly powerful seafaring kingdom, with several important ports, many of which were targeted in the campaign, and which clearly sought to use its position to dominate trade. We know from Chinese sources that they established trade relations with them at a time when maritime commerce with China was becoming more lucrative, and we also hear that they forced foreign ships to dock at their ports in the Strait of Malacca, under threat of attack. They also tried to monopolize the trade of certain luxuries like sandalwood, which they forced merchants to sell to them, and an Arab source tells us that they enforced heavy tolls, with a Jewish merchant traveling to China being made to pay 20,000 dinars in order to pass through the strait. Needless to say, Chola merchants would have had reason to want Srivijaya weakened. At the same time, though, trade didn't benefit Rajendra all that much. As I said before, the merchant guilds were largely independent from the Chola state, and taxation from duties at port cities were a minor part of the king's income. In fact, we don't really get references to these types of taxes until after Rajendra's time. And even if they did exist, whether the merchants were Tamils or Sumatrans probably wouldn't have mattered much to the royal government. There was even a Buddhist temple in the port city of Nagapattinam, which was in part funded by the rulers of Srivijaya before this campaign, presumably for their merchants in South India. Likewise, the inscription for the campaign notes how Rajendra came back with plenty of loot, but doesn't say anything about merchants. With all that said, although the campaign may not have been primarily motivated by trade for Rajendra, the merchant guilds probably had some influence in the decision to attack Srivijaya. The Chola army traveled by ship across the Bay of Bengal, a journey which, with the monsoon winds, if done in December, might have taken around 2 weeks. But the Cholas didn't have a standing navy. Rajendra likely borrowed ships from the merchant guilds in order to transport his troops, and, depending on the size of his army, which again is not clear, he might have also built more specifically for the campaign. It's likely then that Rajendra and the merchant guilds had made a mutually beneficial arrangement. The merchants lent him ships, and may have even lent him money and their troops, to support a campaign which would give Rajendra plenty of plunder and prestige, while also helping the merchants get better conditions in their trade ventures into China, a case of parallel warfare. It was likely the merchants who convinced Rajendra that a campaign into Southeast Asia would be worthwhile. After all, they would know better than anyone else of the wealth of Srivijaya, and potentially how vulnerable it was. In fact, we know from Sri Lankan sources that this is exactly what happened before Raja's campaign there in 991, and the merchant guilds did have a presence there afterwards. This understanding of the campaign, by the way, isn't my original idea. It's held by several historians. It's one interpretation, though the one I find the most sensible. But if you want to learn more, once again, there is a list of recommended readings in the description. So, looking back on everything as a whole, the Chola kingdom, or empire if you prefer, was a powerful state in the 1020s. Its quote-unquote real power on the ground may have varied in different parts of South India, but Rajendra Chola's royal aura could be felt far beyond, all around the Bay of Bengal. It was certainly one of the most impressive kingdoms in the world at the time, and it would remain in this position for decades still. It's a kingdom that few people in the West know very much about. We often talk about India very abstractly without going into much details when discussing history, at least in my circles. But I hope that you found this video both enlightening and entertaining. There's so much about South Asia that's super interesting, and I'll likely be coming back to it at some point in a future video in this series. For now, though, I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.